Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. I didn't finish what I had prepared last week, so I'm going to take just a couple minutes, hopefully, and finish what I started last week, and then we'll get into the rest, hopefully, of Matthew chapter 26. So we left off last week at verse 54 of Matthew 26. This, keep in mind, is the arrest of Jesus, is what we've been studying. Judas comes and he betrays him with a kiss. They come and they seize Jesus. There are these guards that are armed. They have swords and clubs, which is, again, just completely over the top. The word that commentators use for that is superfluous. It's just way too much. And so we come to verse 54, and this is after Peter. We know it's Peter because John says so, but Matthew doesn't say. But one of those with Jesus cuts the servant's ear off, and Jesus rebukes him, and he says in verse 55, or no, we're not there yet. He says in verse 53, Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he'll at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? And so we've just noticed the power and the authority that Jesus has, and what that's showing us is that he's willingly laying his life down. And in verse 54, we get an understanding as to why that is. It says, But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? He references the Scriptures that are being fulfilled in this. Jesus, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, it is the culmination of all of these various prophecies, some of which we'll see and get into in the next section. But the Scriptures must be fulfilled. This is God's plan. This has been God's plan from the beginning, and this is how it is unfolding. When he references the Scriptures, he's not necessarily referring to a specific Scripture, because there's a lot that you could look to that reference what is taking place, what's beginning to take place with Jesus going and suffering. But rather, this is referring to the whole counsel of Scripture, the whole counsel of God. Because what is the story of the Bible about? It's about God redeeming his people by way of Jesus Christ. It was foretold of in the Old Testament. It culminates with Jesus. And then in the New Testament, it's looking back at that moment. And so we're seeing these Scriptures being fulfilled before our very eyes. Verse 55 says, At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. So here, Jesus is highlighting again the irony of this. The fact that the crowd, they come with swords and clubs, and they're arresting someone who's not violent, who hasn't committed a crime, yet here they come with weapons to arrest him. And what this is showing us is they're acting more like a robber than Jesus was. They are the ones, they are incurring this guilt upon themselves, and that will become more evident when we see the trial before the Sanhedrin in the next section. So he says, Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? They're acting more like a robber than Jesus was, which again just heightens the irony of this entire situation as it's unfolding. And he says, Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. It's not as if they haven't had opportunities. Jesus, the things he did, it didn't take place in a corner. His ministry was very public, going in places like the temple, like we've seen since chapter 21, since he came to Jerusalem. And so it makes you wonder, why are they seizing him now, and why are they doing it in this way? They're doing it, of course, to be deceptive. They're doing it at night. They're doing it with a crowd of people who didn't know Jesus, and as they say, the rest is history. And then in verse 56, it says, But all this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. Again, we see that this is the fulfillment of what the Scriptures have said. The prophets prophesied about this, and now it's taking place. Again, Jesus is showing us, and this is consistent with the rest of what Jesus does in the gospel account. What's most important here isn't what Jesus wants, it's what God wants. Jesus, he prays in the garden, not as I will, but as you will. He submits to God. And ultimately, in doing that, their wills become the same. And so what we see here again is the fulfillment of God's word, the fulfillment of God's will. That is what is most important here. And so in short, this is the reason why all of this is taking place. It is the fulfillment of God's plan. Humankind needs a Redeemer. God sends us a Redeemer. We don't earn that. God, because of the love He has to us, because of His grace and His mercy, He offers that to us, and He offers it by way of His Son, Jesus. And then we see at the end of this section what Jesus had prophesied would happen before. He said that the shepherd will be struck and the sheep will scatter. That comes from another prophecy, and here we see it taking shape. All of the disciples left Him and fled. And it's just as Jesus said it would happen. Jesus is referred to as a prophet, and here's an example of Him prophesying something that would happen. And so again, the shepherd, Jesus, is struck, and the sheep scatter. Despite what they had said, they said, we're not going to leave you, we're not going to deny you, and yet here we see them doing the very thing they said that they would not do. Any brief comments or questions on any of that? I hurried through that, but I've got a lot of other material to get through. All right. So now we'll pick up in verse 57 of Matthew 26. I'll slow down a little bit for some of this. Hopefully we'll get through the rest of the chapter today. 70-something verses, 75 verses. This has been a long chapter. The rest of this chapter, there's two stories that are unfolding, and they're parallel stories. They're parallel in a lot of different ways. Some of that I won't highlight here, but really what is going on is you have two trials that are taking place. One is a literal trial with Jesus before the Sanhedrin. The other is Peter as he's questioned by bystanders, as the English Standard puts it. And so the rest of this chapter, you have these two trials that are unfolding. Jesus, he's on trial before the high priest and the council, verses 59 through 68, with a brief introduction in verses 57 and 58. And then you have the trial, quote-unquote, of Peter, starting in verse 69 through the end of the chapter. And so what we see with this, as this unfolds, is these two trials, they are sort of juxtaposed against each other, and there's a big contrast that is being made. And this is something that Matthew does pretty often, where he takes a couple of things and he pins them against each other. And this is a great example of that, where you have a big contrast between Jesus and His trial, and not just the outcome of it and the way Jesus handles it, but just the nature of the trial itself. One's a literal trial with life and death on the line. The other is just Peter before bystanders. Not saying there's not consequences to what he might say, but the consequences, they don't quite line up with each other, if you see what I'm saying. And ultimately, it will result with Jesus being faithful and Peter not being faithful, despite what he had said before. First, we see in verses 57 and 58 sort of an introduction to these two trials. And so starting again in verse 57, it says, Then those who had seized Jesus led Him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. And so here, both trials are introduced here in verses 57 and 58. The trial of Jesus is mentioned in verse 57, and then Peter is briefly mentioned in verse 58. Despite him being sort of tabled until verse 69, he is introduced here in verse 58. So we see here initially that Jesus is led to Caiaphas, the high priest, and the scribes and the elders are also there. This is the Sanhedrin council. This is the Jewish leadership council, and they would convene on religious things. It's really the only authority that they had, but Rome gave them that authority, and so they would meet and convene on certain things, and they usually didn't agree with each other, but they're going to agree against Jesus. This also recalls earlier in this chapter, I know this seems like forever ago because this chapter is so long, but you may remember in verses 3 and 4 of Matthew 26, the same people are seen at Caiaphas's the courtyard of his palace, and they're plotting Jesus' demise. Well, here, they're no longer plotting, they're overseeing it, and they are executing it. And so that is the introduction to Jesus' trial. And then we see in verse 58 that Peter is following Jesus, but he's behind. He's not beside him, but he's behind him. And it says that he's following him at a distance. What this shows us, Peter's already failed. He has said that he would die before he betrays Jesus, yet here he's already trailing behind him. He's not beside him. And we see that he is cowering back. And so already Peter has failed, but of course, if you know the story, it's going to get much worse for Peter. So first, Jesus faces the trial of the Jewish council, also known as the Sanhedrin. So picking up in verse 59 of Matthew 26, it says, "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, 'This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.' Jesus said to him, 'You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his robes and said, 'He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You've now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?' They answered, 'He deserves death.' Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?' As is common with the rest of the story of the suffering of Jesus, this is rich in irony. And it almost seems like the closer we get to the cross, the more ironic it becomes. It just becomes more saturated with this irony. On the one hand, you have the sinless Son of God who is now on trial. What they've done is put him on trial, and then they try to find a crime against him. That's completely backwards. That's not justice. That's not how justice works. The sinless Son of God is on trial. The ones who are administering the trial, namely the high priest, but also the rest of the council, they are actually incurring guilt upon themselves through their practices that they use in this trial, which we'll look at in detail in a moment. And then they are judging the one who will someday judge them. This is perhaps the most ironic thing out of all of it. They're judging the one who will judge all of mankind, and especially them. So the council is making themselves guilty. And here are some of the crimes that they commit. One thing, Matthew is depicting it in a certain way. Luke depicts it differently. In Luke 22, it mentions that this is the next day is when all of this takes place. But Matthew is depicting all of these things being in the same night. The night that he's betrayed, the night that he goes on trial, the night that Peter betrays him. All of these are the same night as Matthew is telling the story. And as Matthew tells it, this is all happening at night. Well, based on their own tradition, this comes from the Mishnah, and the reference there is on the screen, the Sanhedrin 4 and verse 1. The Mishnah prohibited a capital trial from being held at night. You can obviously see why that would be, because that is grounds for corruption, right? It's easy to see why that would be outlawed by their tradition. It's tradition, but it's a good practice to have. And yet we see, as Matthew is depicting this story, they are in blatant violation of that. They're looking to put Jesus to death. They're doing it at night. They're trying to be sneaky about it before they eventually will execute him publicly. So that's one crime that they commit, and that's against their own tradition. And so if they're breaking their own tradition, which they cared so much about, it's no wonder that they break the commands of God as well. One of which, in the fact that they are seeking false testimony against Jesus. That's what Matthew says to us in verse 59. Well, the Torah, the law of Moses, strictly prohibits bearing false witness. That's the wordage that's used. One of the 10 Commandments. You think the 10 Commandments were important to the Jews? They certainly were, and that's one of them in Exodus 20 and verse 16, also Deuteronomy 5 and verse 20. They were not to bear false witness. Now, we take that command, and we typically apply it to everyday life, to lying to each other. And I think it certainly applies to everyday life. Well, how much more then should it apply in a capital trial, when someone's death is on the line, and yet here they're looking for false witnesses? It's not as if someone has come in and is trying to bear false witness, but they're looking for it. They are complicit in this corruption, and in fact, not only are they complicit in it, they are the ones who are behind it. And so how much more should this be true, to not bear false witness when you have a capital trial that is underway? Another one that we might lose sometimes because we're not as familiar with the Old Testament, but this is an interesting one as well. The high priest, when he asked Jesus if he's the Christ, and he asks him again, and Jesus says, "You have said so," and then he makes the statement about the Son of Man coming in the clouds, the high priest tears his robes. Well, the Torah prohibits that. I don't know if you know this, but in Leviticus 21 and verse 10, it prohibits the high priest from tearing his clothes. The high priest is supposed to be even-keeled, I think is the idea behind that. Well, here we see the high priest tearing his clothes. That's a violation of the law of Moses. And so here again is a law that they are breaking. And the pattern that we see here is they hate Jesus so much, and they are so threatened by Jesus, that they are willing to do anything in order to put him away, even violate the law of Moses, that they are so intent on keeping, to the point where they are legalists in that regard. A lot of them are. And so the Torah prohibited this, but Caiaphas doesn't seem to care. Perhaps that speaks to the passion that he has in this moment. I don't know what else to make of it, besides they just don't care about the law. They care more about putting Jesus to death. Another aspect of this is the fact that he's also accusing the Son of God of committing blasphemy. And then that's the charge that they bring against him. Well, this is a little ironic, because while he's accusing the Son of God of committing blasphemy, he himself is blaspheming. The Son of God can't commit blasphemy. That's like saying God is committing blasphemy. It is saying that God is committing blasphemy. And so the irony in this is that, again, as they're trying to make Jesus appear guilty, they continue to make themselves guilty. You could say that it's classic projection. They accuse others of doing things that they themselves are doing. That's certainly true in this case when it comes to the blasphemy. But they just care so much about putting Jesus to death, nothing will get in the way of that, not even the law of Moses. And finally, they will end up mocking and assaulting a man who's not guilty of any crime. This is a gross injustice that happens to Jesus here. And of course, what we see is there's an unjust trial. They twist Jesus' words. Ironically, what they say that Jesus said actually is true. He's speaking of his body, as John tells us in that particular verse as he records it. But it's an unjust trial. They're twisting his words. He's not guilty of any crime. And yet, this results in what will be an unjust punishment. So we learn some things about the Jewish council. But we also learn some things about Jesus as well. If you didn't see, there's a handout on the back table. It has some scripture references on here. That's all it is Bible verses. I'll have the references on the screen, but the verses itself aren't on there. But if you want to get one of those sheets to take home, you can. I'll read from here as well. If you didn't grab one, you can at least hear it. Or you could get up and get one too if you didn't. But we learn some things here about Jesus. One thing we see is that he is indeed the Son of David who will come and who will build a temple for God. If you've been keeping track with our sermon series through Chronicles, this is a point that I've drawn out. We typically think of that prophecy and we think of, okay, Solomon builds the temple, so Solomon is the fulfillment of at least that aspect of it. But Jesus also fulfills the aspect of building a temple for God in the sense that he builds the church. He said he can rebuild it in 3 days. And in that case, he's actually speaking of his body. He is the temple, the dwelling place of God here on the earth. He is the Word that tabernacled here among us. And so the references there come from 2 Samuel 7 and 1 Chronicles 17. In 2 Samuel 7, and so first in Matthew 26 and verse 61, they accuse Jesus of saying, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Well, that's a true statement. He's speaking of his body. He's going to be raised on the third day. That's what he's talking about when he says that. And we see the fulfillment of 2 Samuel 7 in this. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I'll raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. He's speaking to David here. And I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Jesus actually fulfills this in more ways than one. He establishes the temple, which is his body, when he's raised from the dead, and then also he does so by way of establishing his church. We also see that Jesus is the suffering servant of Isaiah, who remains silent and who also is spat upon. There's two references to Isaiah here that are drawn out. So we see in verse 63 of this chapter of Matthew 26 that Jesus remained silent. That is the direct fulfillment of what we read in Isaiah 53 and verse 7, where it says, He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. That's almost word for word the same thing, what Matthew says here of Jesus and what the prophet Isaiah says. He opened not his mouth. He remained silent. We also see at the end of, in verse 67 of Matthew 26, it says, They spit in his face and they struck him. Well, that only is fulfilling what Jesus said in Matthew 5 about turning the other cheek. Jesus is living that out. But we also see in Isaiah 50 and verse 6, he says, I gave my back for those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. So here again, through all of this injustice that's happening to Jesus, we not only see the character of the Jewish council, we also see the character of Jesus. These prophecies are coming into fruition. And that is something that is very common, of course, in Matthew's gospel. Then we see that he's the Son of Man, the one who is prophesied of in Daniel chapter 7, the one who comes in the clouds from heaven, the one who's given dominion and authority forever. And so Jesus, this comes from the mouth of Jesus when he says, I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, look at Daniel 7 and in verse 13 and 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. That's the title, the most frequently used title that Jesus uses of himself, Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So here again, Jesus, he is the Son of Man that Daniel prophesies about, the one who comes on the clouds, the one who's given this dominion and authority and a kingdom forever and ever. And then we see that he is the king, not just from the obvious reference to Daniel as the Son of Man who has an everlasting kingdom, but also in the fact that he says that you'll see the Son of Man, the same verse, verse 64, seated at the right hand of power. Makes one think perhaps of Psalm 110 and verse 1, where it says, The Lord says to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Here again, we see Jesus is the king. He sits at the right hand of the Father. He's reigning from there to this day. And so we learn not just about the nature and the character of the Sanhedrin and the evil that they have in their heart and the hatred that they have toward Jesus, but we learn some things about Jesus as well. Davies and Allison, I reference them quite a lot. Their commentary on Matthew is really good. It's kind of a lengthy quote, but I think it really highlights the irony that we see through this story, through the trial of Jesus. And so I have the entire quote on the screen. It says, "The chief literary feature of this section, verses 57 to 68, is its irony. The authorities pass judgment on the one who will someday pass judgment on them. They, by seeking false witnesses, and the high priest, by rending his robe, disobey Moses. Whereas Jesus, by refusing an oath, lives by his messianic Torah." He's fulfilling the law, like he said he would do in Matthew chapter 5. "The authorities mock Jesus' claim to be the Davidic Messiah, the fulfillment of Old Testament hopes, while their very actions bring to pass in Jesus prophecies about Isaiah's suffering servant." And this really highlights the irony of this. They're mocking him while at the same time fulfilling what is going on. They accuse Jesus of blasphemy, and yet it is they who blaspheme the Son of God. Lastly, those who accuse Jesus of saying that he will destroy the temple of God and in 3 days build another, themselves help fulfill the prophecy. For by handing him over to Pilate, they are creating the circumstance that makes it possible for the temple of his body to be raised in 3 days. So the Sanhedrin has everything backwards. All it does is ironic. I think that really puts well just the nature of these circumstances, and truly, there's not a better word you could use other than ironic, perhaps maybe moronic on their part, but you see how everything is backwards. It's almost like living an opposite day. Everything that they are doing, it's playing into what God is doing, and that, I think, is a great example, perhaps the greatest example, of God taking things and using it for His purposes. Oh, there was more I forgot. "And it ignorantly acts against its own true interest. This is crystal clear to the reader. It will not, however, be evident to Jesus' persecutors until the parousia." That's a fancy word referring to Jesus' second coming. So again, they're acting against their own interests, despite what they think that they're doing. We see that they really don't know what they're doing. Any comments or questions on any of that? CJ?
Do you think the straw that broke the camel's back was verse 64? Do you think they caught on to Daniel 7 and that reference being about God, the Son of Man? Is that why they say he's committed blasphemy? Do you think they call on that?
Well, he refers to himself as the Son of Man all the time. That's the most frequently used title that he uses of himself. So I don't know if that in and of itself is what you said is the straw that broke the camel's back. I think it's when they ask him if he's the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he says, "You have said so." He affirms that. I think that's what is over the top for them, because in saying that, he's saying he's equal to God, being his son. That is where they get the accusation of blasphemy from. But of course, and if Jesus is wrong in saying that, then it would be blasphemy. But of course, he's right. He is indeed the Son of God. And that's something that Matthew's readers, they would have read Peter say in Matthew 16, "You're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God." That good confession was made earlier. So that's present in the minds of Matthew's readers, and it should be present in our minds as well. Next, we see the trial of Peter. His trial is not before a court, but it's before first a servant girl, then a servant girl and some bystanders, and then eventually just some bystanders. And what we see happen with Peter, just as Jesus sort of, if you pay attention to the structure of it, it's sort of a triad of questions that are asked. Peter also faces a triad of questions, a series of 3, and each one, it increases the drama as it goes on. This is something that Matthew does a lot. An example of this is the temptation of Jesus. with each temptation that the devil gives, it becomes more and more enticing. And also there's, if you remember that, the literal height of the temptations of Jesus, it increases at every level. Starts perhaps at ground level, then it eventually goes to the pinnacle of the temple, and then it goes to a high mountain. And so here we see growing drama again. Each time, so there's the three denials that Peter makes. Jesus, of course, said that this would happen. But each time he's questioned and he gives an answer, each time the question becomes more public. He starts in a private sort of place, and then it gets more public each time. That heightens the drama. Also, Peter's denials become more intense each time. First it's a simple statement, then it's an oath, then it's a curse. And eventually, with the scene moving from more private to public, Peter, sort of ironically, is also moving farther and farther away from Jesus in a literal and also perhaps a figurative sense. So I'll read this, I guess, verses 69 through 75. It says, "Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, 'You also were with Jesus the Galilean.' But he denied it before them all, saying, 'I do not know what you mean.' And when he went out of the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, 'This man was with Jesus of Nazareth.' And again he denied it with an oath, 'I do not know the man.' After a little while the bystanders came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you.' And then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know the man.' And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, 'Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly." So there's a lot that's taking shape here. One, this kind of gets lost in translation, and I'm not sure why this is. I'm not saying I know better than the people that translated the Bible. But there's an interesting thing that happens. In verse 69, the first word that's used there is the Greek word day. And it's translated, I think, in every modern and perhaps even older English translations as now. It says, "Now Peter was sitting outside." But the word day, it's a delta and an epsilon, so DE, it is most frequently translated as the word but. And the primary way that this word is used is as a conjunction. A conjunction is a word that links one word from another. The word and is an example of that. But is another example of that. It joins things together, but in a contrasting way. And that's the primary way that the word day in Greek is used. And I think that what Matthew's doing here is showing us the contrast between Jesus and Peter. They're both seemingly on trial. One's a literal trial. The other is more or less a trial in public. And Matthew is showing us the big contrast between Peter and Jesus. Jesus will be faithful. Peter, of course, will not. And so when you compare these two against each other, the contrast is really quite, it's obvious. First, we see that while Peter is in the courtyard, they're watching the trial of Jesus, he's approached by a servant girl or a slave girl. That's in verses 69 and 70. We see that she accuses him of being with Jesus. She says, "You were with him, you were with Jesus the Galilean." So she accuses him of having been with Jesus. And there's a lot of reasons perhaps as to why. Maybe she recognized him. Later on they say his accent betrays him, so on and so forth. Either way, it's pretty evident that Peter was one who was with Jesus. Well, he denies it. And notice the way he does so. He says, "I do not know what you mean." He doesn't necessarily say, "I don't know him," but he says, "I don't know what you're talking about." He phrases this as a simple statement. "I don't know what you mean." She says, "You were with Jesus." He says, "I don't know what you're talking about." That's the first denial. Then we get to the second denial, and the scene shifts from the courtyard now to the entrance of the courtyard. So he's leaving. He's in the process of leaving. He's in the entrance, and he is accused again by another servant girl, except she doesn't address Peter. She addresses the bystanders. And so again, she says in verse 71, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, the accusation isn't even necessarily that he's a follower of Jesus, but that he was with him. And perhaps there's connotations of being a follower when you're with Jesus, but this time, Peter denies it with an oath. And it makes one think of what Jesus says about oaths in Matthew 5. He says, don't swear an oath at all. Let your yes be yes, yet let your no be no. Anything more comes from the evil one. Certainly here we see that this oath comes from the evil one because he's denying Jesus again. So he takes an oath. He says, I do not know the man. We see the growing intensity of his denial. And then we come to the third one. And this time, those bystanders address Peter themselves in verse 73, where they say, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Well, now it's obvious that Peter was one of them that was with Jesus. They're certain in their claim. They say the word certainly. Certainly you too are one of them. His accent betrays him. So it's obvious to these people. Peter can try to deny it, but they know the truth. Well, this time, to heighten things further, probably because it is so obvious, he not only swears, but he invokes a curse on himself. And he says again, I do not know the man. So here you see the progression of his denial. We've gone from a simple denial, I don't know what you're talking about, to swearing an oath, to now invoking a curse. It's gotten more intense each time. And then immediately it says, the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered. Jesus had said, you will betray me 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter denied it. He said, I'll die with you before I do that. And yet here, and you remember when we went over that, we highlighted the fact that Peter thought he knew better than Jesus. Well, obviously he didn't. You can't know better than Jesus. And there's another ironic thing that's going on here. Remember in verse 68, they slapped him and they say, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? All the while that Jesus is being mocked to prophesy, one of his prophecies is being fulfilled in this sequence of events. What he said about Peter is true, and it happens. So we see the contrast between the trials of Jesus and Peter. Now, the contrast is an obvious one. First, there's just the circumstances of the trials. Jesus is in a real trial before the Jewish council. His life is in the balance. Then you have Peter, who's not in a court, but is initially in a courtyard. He's a spectator of the trial. And eventually he leaves, and we see that he's in public, and the consequences of Peter are much less than the consequences of Jesus. Although I won't say that they would be none. You don't know what would have happened if Peter would have said, yes, I was with him. They may have arrested Peter too. We don't necessarily know. But the consequences are certainly less than what is at stake for Jesus. Then there's the fact that Jesus is being falsely accused. They're looking for false witnesses. And then they actually, sort of ironically, make a truthful statement, but they twist it to mean something that it doesn't mean when he says that he'll rebuild the temple in 3 days. And yet Jesus does not make a defense for himself. He opens not his mouth. All the while, Peter is being rightly accused. They say, oh, you're with him. Well, he certainly was. And yet he opens his mouth and he lies. He denies Jesus. And both of these have in common, of course, the fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus, in not opening his mouth, fulfills the suffering servant of Isaiah prophecy. Peter, of course, fulfills the prophecy of Christ when he says, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And finally, 1 second, Garfield. One can't help but be reminded of the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 10. If you look there in Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33, this seems like we went over this a long time ago, and perhaps it's because we did go over it a long time ago. He says here, everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. And so here you have the contrast of acknowledging Jesus before men versus denying him before men. And we see this playing out here with these two trials, with Jesus and with Peter. Jesus is showing us how to acknowledge himself before men. They say, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" And Jesus confirms it. "You have said so." So we see here Jesus shows us how to acknowledge himself before men. Peter, of course, shows us the other side of that, how to deny him before men. This is a big contrast that we're seeing here. This further highlights the failure of the disciples. And if anything, this is perhaps the climax of the failure of the disciples. You could argue that Judas betraying him is the climax. That takes us through Matthew 26. Any comments or questions? Garfield, you had one.
I was going to make a comment about the rooster. I was wondering what time of day it was, because generally a rooster only crows in the morning. It's unusual for them to be crowing any other time of the day. Usually always in the morning you hear the rooster crow.
Well, the next verse in chapter 27 and verse 1 is when morning came. So in terms of the specific hour, it could be late in the night, early in the morning, one of those things. I'm not sure the specific time, but we see that morning is the next thing that comes at the beginning of chapter 27. So, Steve.
In verse 63, the high priest placed Jesus under an oath, and Jesus declared under oath who he was.
Yeah.
And then in verse 72, Peter placed himself under an oath and denied who Jesus was. So there's another kind of big contrast. Right?
Yeah, another contrast. That's a good point. When the high priest says, "I adjure you," that's him placing Jesus under oath, and Jesus under oath affirms his identity as the Christ. Peter invokes an oath on himself, and he, of course, denies Jesus. Another big contrast there. Amos?
Well, I just remember when we were studying a year or two ago on this particular setting here, that later on Jesus talks to Peter and asks and tells him, "Do you love me?" How many times does he go through that? 3 times. And they were associated with the three denials that Peter made in this instance here. He just goes back and asks him, "Tend my sheep."
Feed my flock, so on, yeah.
And I remember how it was tied together. Why does he repeat himself 3 times that way? Going back to the 3 times that Peter denied Christ.
The Amos references in John's gospel account. So all 4 gospel accounts record the denials of Peter, the threefold denial. John records a pretty intimate story between Jesus and John after the resurrection, where then Jesus sort of gives Peter a chance to redeem himself. "Do you love me, Peter?" He asks him that 3 times. 3 times Peter, of course, says yes. Each time, though, it gets also kind of more intense, and if you look at the language, I think it's the first 2 times Peter uses the word for brotherly love. Then the 3rd time he finally uses the agape love. And so that kind of heightens the intensity of that as well. And there's some obvious parallelism there that John is bringing out in his gospel account. It is a really neat story. All right, thanks for your attention.